The day the owner's son tried to force me out, I realized something important. He had absolutely no idea what I actually did for the company. Not a clue. He thought ISO audits were just paperwork, compliance was a formality, and my 23 years of process design could be replaced by whatever he scribbled on a whiteboard during his morning coffee. The hook came fast, like a punch. "We're modernizing," he said. "Your role is outdated." Outdated. That was the word he chose for the systems that had kept his father's company running like a quiet, well-oiled machine for decades. The word he used for the person who built the documentation that protected them during every contract negotiation, every supplier incident, every customer dispute. He said it with that smile, tight, smug, the kind of smile people wear when they've never had to earn a consequence in their life. And just like that, I understood. He wasn't firing me because he had a better plan. He was firing me because he wanted control of something he didn't understand. Fine. Let him have it. I packed my belongings slowly, neatly. I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I didn't mention the audit scheduled 3 weeks out, the one I had already prepped extensively for, the one he didn't even know was on the calendar because he never read internal notices. I didn't tell him that the documentation library he dismissed as outdated was, in fact, the only thing keeping several of their certifications from collapsing. I didn't tell him the supplier nonconformity file was 3 days from breaching the reporting deadline. I didn't tell him that removing me from the compliance chain automatically triggered a clause in their customer contracts requiring a notice period and a process review, a clause he also didn't know existed. Because he'd never read the contracts either. So I left. But I didn't leave quietly. I left with my dignity, my original work, and a paper trail that showed exactly how much I had held together over the years. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't alter anything. I didn't delete a single file. I simply walked away. And the company walked straight into the audit. That was the moment everything snapped. The auditor arrived expecting the usual, organized documents, completed logs, verifiable corrective actions, trained personnel. Instead, he found a confused 27-year-old with a polished watch, a perfect haircut, and not a single clue where the internal audit records were kept. The auditor's face must have been priceless. Then he began digging. And one by one, the failures surfaced, like cracks hidden beneath a coat of cheap paint. Incomplete CAPA logs. Unapproved document changes. A missing training matrix. Supplier incidents left unanswered. Risk assessments untouched for 8 months. Calibration overdue on half the instruments. Customer complaint reports unclosed. The owner's son kept saying the same thing. "I thought someone else handled that." The auditor finally asked, "Who?" The silence answered for him. The failure wasn't minor. It wasn't fixable with a band-aid. It was systemic, the kind of failure that leads to suspensions and lost contracts. By the end of the audit, their largest client, the one whose contract required full ISO compliance, activated a review. Then they froze orders. Then they asked for documentation the company suddenly couldn't produce. 3 weeks later, I got a call. Not from the son. From the father. He sounded older than I remembered. He asked me if I could come back temporarily to help fix things. His voice carried the weight of someone who just discovered the cost of trusting the wrong person. I told him politely but firmly that I had already signed with another company. A better one. One that valued competence over lineage. He understood. He didn't argue. He just sighed, like a man realizing too late that the bridge he'd allowed someone else to burn was one he desperately needed. Their audit failure became industry gossip. Their certification was suspended. Their biggest client left. Half their production halted. And the owner's son? He wasn't fired, technically. but he was quietly moved into a business development role with no real authority. A title with no teeth. Everyone knew what it meant. As for me, I moved forward, lighter, respected, properly compensated. My new company built systems with me, not around me, and the difference was night and day. I never gloated. Never mocked. Never rubbed it in. But sometimes, when someone asks why I always keep my documentation airtight and my process logs immaculate, I smile a little. Because once, a long time ago, someone thought those things didn't matter. And the audit proved them wrong. The fallout didn't happen in an explosion. It happened in slow motion, like a building sagging under its own neglected beams until one day gravity finally wins. 2 months after the failed audit, I heard, through the same quiet channels where all industry truths eventually surface, that the company had lost a second major client. Not because of the sun. Not because of the audit itself. But because the suspension forced a mandatory compliance review, and that review uncovered years of corners they didn't even know they'd been cutting. Without me there to keep the foundation level, the cracks widened fast. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't sabotage. It was simply exposure. Lean teams, tight schedules, rushed managers, when everything is barely held together on a good day, removing a single structural piece is enough to send the whole thing swaying. And I had been that structural piece, though no one realized it until it disappeared. Meanwhile, I had settled fully into my new role, Director of Compliance and Systems Integration at a firm that actually respected what the title meant. My first months were a blur of building frameworks, cleaning up legacy processes, and mentoring younger staff who were seeing good systems for the first time. But the biggest difference wasn't the paycheck or the upgraded office or the boardroom seat. It was the culture. People actually listened. If I said a corrective action needed immediate attention, it was addressed within hours. If I raised a concern about a supplier, it sparked a meeting, not an eye roll. If I proposed improvements, they didn't die in committee, they were implemented. The work felt purposeful again, not like a daily wrestling match against incompetence and inherited authority. But the story of my old workplace wasn't done with me yet. One afternoon, during a quarterly partner review, I was presenting our latest audit performance metrics. As the meeting wrapped up, the VP of Operations leaned over and said quietly, "You know, we've been approached twice in the past month by your former employer. They want to license some of our new tracking modules." I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. "We haven't responded yet. But their situation looks messy." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I already knew what messy meant in our world. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cold, clear air. My phone buzzed with a message from an old colleague. They're doing a full leadership restructure. Owners stepping back. Sun isn't in the picture anymore. There it was. The final inevitable domino. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wished failure on them. But because systems don't lie. If you ignore maintenance, the machine will fail. If you ignore processes, the risks will surface. If you ignore the people who hold everything together, the whole structure collapses by its own weight. Back then, the owner's son believed he could fire me and nothing would change. He thought processes were ornamental. That compliance was a binder on a shelf. That the company ran because he said so. But systems don't care who your parents are. Eventually, someone will ask for proof. They will ask to see the logs. They will ask to verify the training. They will ask to review the records. They will check if what you say matches what you do. And when those things weren't there, when they weren't maintained, tracked, or understood, the entire facade evaporated. That night, as I sat at home reviewing a proposal for a new automation platform, I felt something strange settle over me. Not triumph. Not bitterness. Not even satisfaction. Just closure. Complete and quiet. I had walked away with grace. They had lived with the consequences of their choices. And life had placed me exactly where I needed to be, surrounded by people who valued the work I once did in the shadows. The owner's son tried to force me out. The ISO audit did the rest. And the world, as it always does, kept moving, carrying me forward while leaving them exactly where their decisions had led. The real twist came a year later, quiet, unexpected, and almost poetic. Our company had just wrapped a massive integration project for a multinational client. The rollout went so cleanly that the client requested a follow-up workshop, this time hosted on-site at one of their regional hubs. I flew out with my team, ran the sessions, and spent the rest of the week reviewing new opportunities with their senior leadership. On the final afternoon, the client's compliance director, a sharp, detail-obsessed woman I respected immensely, invited me to sit in on a vendor review panel. I wasn't officially required. I wasn't even scheduled. She just smiled and said, "You'll want to be here for this one." Curiosity won. I stepped into the conference room. And there it was. My old company's logo on the screen. I froze for half a second, but not from nerves. More from the surrealness of seeing the past walk right into my present. They had applied to become a secondary supplier for one of the client's subsidiaries. And, based on the paperwork in front of me, they were desperate for the contract. The owner wasn't presenting. The son wasn't presenting. Instead, two unfamiliar managers walked in, along with someone from their quality department I vaguely recognized but had never worked closely with. They didn't see me at first. They were too busy setting up their slides, whispering nervously, shuffling papers. Then the presentation began. It was painful. They stumbled through metrics. They couldn't answer basic questions without checking notes. Their incident tracking numbers didn't align with their corrective action summary. And the worst part, their new quality framework looked eerily familiar, like someone had taken pieces of the system I built, chopped it apart, and tried to reassemble it without understanding why the pieces fit the way they did. It was like watching someone try to rebuild a clock using only half the gears. The client's director flipped through their documentation packet calmly, expression unreadable. Then she set it down and asked, "Your last ISO audit was suspended. Can you walk us through the corrective actions and independent verification results?" Silence. Then stumbling. Then vague answers. Then a shaky claim of ongoing resolution. She nodded and looked at me. "Anything you'd like to add?" The room went completely still. The presenters turned toward me, confusion melting into recognition, and then dread. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't twist the knife. That wasn't my job, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. But I told the truth. Calmly. Professionally. Completely. I explained what a proper recovery process should look like. I explained the time and structure required to regain customer trust. I explained the gaps in their documentation, clearly, respectfully, objectively. And I made it clear that the inconsistencies weren't minor. They were structural. When I finished, no one argued. Not even them. The panel thanked the presenters and dismissed them politely. As the door closed behind them, the compliance director leaned back and exhaled. "That," she said, "is what happens when a company loses the one person who knew where the load-bearing walls were." I didn't respond immediately. I just felt the truth of it settle on my chest. We moved on with our agenda. A few days later, the client informed us they were rejecting my old company's bid. Not because of personal connections. Not because of me. Because systems tell the truth. Months flowed by, steady and full. My team grew. Our projects expanded. We became the kind of firm others used as a benchmark. And one evening, just after we closed our fiscal year with the strongest numbers we'd ever seen, I stepped out onto my balcony with a cup of coffee and thought about how strange life is. If the owner's son hadn't forced me out, I might still be there, quiet, overworked, undervalued, patching holes no one else saw. If he hadn't misunderstood my role, their foundation might have stayed intact. If he hadn't pushed so hard, I never would have built the life that unfolded afterward. Their downfall wasn't my revenge. My growth was. And the best part? I never had to raise my voice. I never had to sabotage anything. I never had to look back. The audit, the contracts, the clients, they all revealed a simple fact: you can fire the person, but you can't fire the truth. And the truth always surfaces. Eventually. Inevitably. Precisely when it needs to. A few weeks later, something happened that gave the entire journey its final, unexpected full stop. I was at a regional quality conference, one of those gatherings where you see old colleagues, trade war stories, learn new tools, and quietly judge which companies have their act together. I'd been invited to speak on a panel about resilience and compliance frameworks. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical, grounded work. After the session ended, people came up to ask questions, exchange cards, share experiences. Eventually the crowd thinned, and I stepped over to the refreshment table for a cup of tea. That's when I heard a familiar voice. It was the owner. He looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. Like someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long. His eyes had a tired kindness, the kind you only see in leaders who've been humbled more than once. He approached with a slow, hesitant nod. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to stand beside me. "Of course," I said. There was a long pause. Not tense, just heavy enough to make space for honesty. "I want to apologize," he said quietly, "for how everything ended. I trusted my son when I shouldn't have. I ignored people I shouldn't have. And we paid for it." He looked down at his hands. "I thought you left angry," he continued. "But the way you handled yourself afterward, the professionalism, the integrity. It taught me more than any audit ever has." I didn't say anything right away. I gave him the space to say what he needed to say. "We're rebuilding," he said. "Properly this time. We had to start almost from scratch. And I just wanted you to know, your work didn't go unnoticed. It kept us afloat longer than we deserved." I nodded slowly. "I'm glad the company is finding its footing again." He managed a tired smile. "We are. But it's different now, leaner, smarter, less arrogant. Or, at least trying to be." Another pause. Then he said something I didn't expect. "My son left the business. He said he wanted something more exciting. Maybe it was for the best." He chuckled softly, a sound filled with old regrets and new acceptance. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just needed to say thank you. And I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't redemption. But it was real. And that mattered more than all the chaos that came before." We talked for a few more minutes about industry changes, new regulations, future trends. Then he excused himself politely, leaving me alone with my tea and the unexpected quiet that settled inside me. It struck me then, this wasn't revenge anymore. It was release. The past no longer tugged at me. Their mistakes no longer defined me. Their downfall no longer concerned me. I had moved on, fully. Cleanly. And they, finally, had learned what I'd tried to teach them years ago: competence isn't a luxury. It's infrastructure. And when you remove it, things fall. On my flight home, I felt something I hadn't expected when all this began: gratitude. Not for the pain, not for the unfairness, but for the push that had forced me onto a path I never would have chosen on my own, but one that had become the best thing that ever happened to me. By the time the plane touched down, the story felt complete. The owner's son forced me out. The ISO audit failed. The company learned. I grew. Life rearranged everything the way it needed to. And that, right there, was the real ending, not triumph. Not collapse. But clarity. A clean, final understanding that some exits aren't losses, they're instructions. And following them leads you exactly where you were meant to be. A few months passed, and life settled into something steady, something grounded. My days were filled with building systems that actually mattered, mentoring younger analysts who were hungry to learn, and shaping a department with the kind of clarity I'd always wished for in my old job. But life has a habit of giving you one last chapter, one you don't expect, and one you don't realize is coming until it's already unfolding. It started on a Monday morning when my assistant knocked on my office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "No appointment. Says it's important." I'm not the type who enjoys surprise visits, but something in her tone made me nod her in. A man stepped in. Mid-30s. Disheveled though he tried to hide it. Wearing an expensive suit that didn't fit him the way expensive suits should. It took me a moment. Then it hit me. The owner's son. The same man who once smirked when he told me my role was outdated. The same man who dismissed 2 decades of systems expertise because he believed authority was inherited like a wristwatch. But now, his eyes were nothing like before. The arrogance was gone, burned away, probably, by the fire he had accidentally set under his own career. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. My instinct was to say no. But growth isn't only forward, it's also about not letting old versions of yourself dictate new choices. So I gestured to the chair. He sat. And for a few seconds, he just breathed, as though he'd rehearsed something but couldn't bring himself to say the first line. Finally, "I know I was the reason you left," he said quietly. "I know I didn't understand what you did, or how much you did. And I know that everything that happened afterward was partly my fault." He swallowed hard. "You don't owe me a conversation. But I needed to face this. Face what I caused." I stayed silent. Sometimes silence is kinder than interruption. He continued, "When the audit failed, I thought I could fix it. I thought I'd get another chance. But every time I tried to repair something, I realized I didn't even know what I was looking at." His voice cracked just slightly. "I thought leadership meant taking control. I didn't understand that it meant carrying responsibility." A long pause. "My father told me recently that the best leaders he ever knew were the ones who listened. The ones who valued the people who knew the actual work. I wish I'd learned that sooner." He looked up at me then, not as a former boss's son, not as someone who had once wielded undeserved authority, but as a person who finally understood the cost of his ignorance. "I'm not here to ask for a job," he said quickly. "I know that's off the table. I'm here because I wanted to apologize to the person I disrespected the most. There was no bitterness in me. Not anymore." His downfall wasn't satisfying, it was predictable. And his apology didn't feel triumphant, it felt human. I nodded slowly. "I hope," I said, "you take what you've learned into whatever you do next." He exhaled, like someone who had been waiting for permission to breathe again. "I will," he said. He stood, thanked me again, and left with a quiet dignity I never thought I'd see in him. Later that day, I found myself staring out the office window, not thinking about revenge, not thinking about the past, but thinking about how different life had become. Revenge had never been the point. Growth had been. Integrity had been. Walking through the fire and coming out clearer, steadier, stronger, that had been the real arc. That evening, as I walked out of the building, I felt a surprising lightness. Not because he apologized. Not because of vindication. But because the story had finally landed where it was meant to land, not in anger. Not in triumph. In understanding. His. Mine. Everyone's. And with that final thread tied off, I stepped into the cool evening air, knowing, truly knowing, that I wasn't defined by the place that forced me out. I was defined by the place I built afterward. And by the person I became on the way there. If you want, I can extend the story further, perhaps a reflective final scene, or a last moment that bridges into the narrator's future. A full year passed before the final, quiet chapter revealed itself, subtle, almost accidental, the kind of moment that doesn't feel significant until you're already standing inside it. It began with an email. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just a simple subject line, request for consultation, confidential. The sender? A mid-sized manufacturing firm preparing for their first certification audit. No connection to my old company. No shared clients. Just a business looking for guidance from someone who had built resilient systems before. I accepted the engagement. It was structured, short-term, and straightforward, exactly the kind of challenge I enjoyed now. What I didn't know was how deeply connected this final thread would be. On the third day on site, while reviewing their preventative maintenance procedures, the operations manager casually mentioned, "We're trying to avoid the mess that happened to a supplier of ours last year. Audit disaster. Cost them their certification. They're still struggling." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. My old company's story had become a cautionary tale. Not out of spite. Not out of gossip. But because, in the quality world, stories like that become lessons, ones people share to avoid repeating the same mistakes. I didn't react outwardly. I kept reviewing documents, asking questions, guiding the redesign. But that night, in my hotel room, it hit me. My legacy at the old place wasn't the failure that happened after I left. It was the stability that had existed while I was there. People don't talk about what collapses unless it once stood tall. And I had built the tall part. A week later, I wrapped up the engagement, handed over a clean, structured framework, and flew home. My team welcomed me back with the usual half-joking complaints about how everything seemed to break the moment I disappeared. I laughed, teased them back, and settled into my office to catch up. Then, late that evening, long after most of the building had emptied, my phone buzzed. A name popped up I rarely saw anymore, the owner. I hesitated, then picked up. His voice was gentler this time, lighter but older. "I won't take long," he said. "I just wanted to tell you, we finally passed our surveillance audit." I leaned back, surprised. "That's good news." "Truly." "We had to rebuild almost everything," he continued. "New systems, new training, new documentation. It took a long time." I could hear the humility in his voice, earned, not performed. "But the consultants we hired kept saying something over and over," he said. "You used to have an excellent foundation. Someone did this right at one point." A pause. And of course, I knew who they meant. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He exhaled softly. "I know we can't undo the past. I know I let arrogance get in the way of sense. But I wanted you to hear, from me, that the structure you built saved us longer than we deserved. And rebuilding it taught us more than we ever learned keeping it standing." Another pause. "You didn't just help the company. You left a mark on the entire way we think now." This time, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was respectful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For all of it. We ended the call on simple, sincere terms. When I set the phone down, the office was completely silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Outside, the city lights blurred softly through the glass, steady, endless, indifferent to every rise and fall that played out beneath them. And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, I felt the story settle completely, not as revenge, not as vindication, but as evolution. Their fall wasn't my victory. Their apology wasn't my closure. The closure had come long before, quietly, gradually, as I built a life where I wasn't holding everything together alone. This call was just the last page turning. I stood, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the hallway. My reflection in the darkened glass looked older, wiser, grounded. A person shaped not by conflict, but by persistence. As I stepped outside and felt the cold night air hit my face, I understood something simple and freeing. Sometimes the universe doesn't give you revenge. Sometimes it gives you perspective. And perspective is the kind of power no one can take away. Weeks later, the final moment of this entire journey arrived, not dramatic, not loud, but so quietly fitting that it felt like life giving me a knowing nod. I was invited to speak at a national quality summit, one of those events where leaders gather to talk about the future of compliance, automation, and organizational integrity. It was an honor, and the keynote panel was packed with people whose work I'd admired for years. My topic was simple: systems don't fail suddenly, people ignore the warnings slowly. The room was full, the lights low, the audience focused. I spoke about resilience, about documentation as a living structure, about how companies treat systems like decoration until the day they realize everything depends on them. I talked about leadership, not the title, but the responsibility, and how real authority comes from clarity, not ego. And as I spoke, I noticed something. People weren't nodding because they agreed. They were nodding because they recognized the truth in their own organizations. When my talk ended, the applause was warm and steady. I stepped off the stage, grabbed a cup of water, and blended into the audience while the next speaker prepared. Then someone approached me. A woman in her late 20s, badge clipped awkwardly to her blazer, notebook clutched in her hands like it was armor. "Your talk," she began, "it meant more than you know." She told me she was the only compliance analyst in her company. Overworked. Underheard. Constantly battling leadership that didn't understand the value of what she did. She said she had been on the verge of quitting. "But hearing you," she said, voice shaking just slightly, "made me realize I'm not crazy. The work matters. I matter. And I'm going to fight for what's right, maybe not loudly, but consistently." That moment landed harder than any applause, any recognition, any compliment. Because there it was, the real legacy. Not the audit. Not the collapse. Not the apology. Not the quiet revenge life delivered all on its own. The legacy was this: my experience was becoming someone else's map. We spoke for a few minutes about her company, her frustrations, her hopes. I gave her practical advice, not pep talks. Clarity she could actually use. When she walked away, she had a steadier posture. And I felt something settle inside me with a sense of finality. The story wasn't about what I lost. It wasn't even about what I endured. It was about what I had become, and what I could pass on. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked over the city. The wind was cool, the lights endless, the world moving in its quiet, unstoppable rhythm. And I realized, revenge had never been the endgame. Revenge had been the bait life used to push me into growth. What truly mattered was the strength I built from the fallout. The clarity I carved from the chaos. The integrity I held onto when everything tried to strip it away. The owner's son forcing me out wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of the part where I finally stepped into my own. The failed ISO audit wasn't my victory. It was the echo that proved I had built something real. And this moment, standing here, helping others rise, this was the quiet, mature, unmistakable triumph. The story no longer belonged to the place that pushed me out. It belonged entirely to the life I built after. In the end, I didn't need an audience to witness what happened, or an apology from the people who caused it. Life had already delivered its verdict in a way no confrontation ever could. The company moved on with its losses, its reshuffling, its lessons learned far too late. And I moved on with something far greater, my clarity, my confidence, and a future that wasn't tied to anyone's ego or permission. What happened to them was noise. What happened to me was growth. And as I stepped forward into the next chapter of my life, steady, sure, and unburdened, I finally understood the quiet truth at the heart of it all. Sometimes the world removes you from places you've outgrown long before you realize it. Not as punishment, but as preparation. And when the dust settles, you don't look back to see who fell. You look ahead to see how far you've risen.